How does the airline that made flying cheap go completely broke? Spirit Airlines made flying affordable for millions of Americans. $9 base fares, $19 flights, prices so low that people who had never flown before could suddenly afford to. At its peak, Spirit Airlines was flying up to 30 million passengers a year. According to Wall Street Journal, on Thursday evening, May 1st, 2026, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick got on a 15-minute phone call with Spirit CEO Dave Davis. By the end of that call, both men agreed that the airline had run out of alternatives. Now, Spirit wanted to shut down on a quiet day. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays have the lightest flight schedules, but they didn't have enough cash to make it till Tuesday. Early Saturday morning, Spirit notified its staff and packed its fleet of yellow planes. It was done. Now, Spirit Airlines has had 2 bankruptcies in less than a year, $1.2 billion in annual losses, a $3.8 billion merger blocked by a judge on antitrust grounds, a restructuring plan overtaken by a war in the Middle East, a last-ditch $500 million government bailout that fell apart at the final hour. How does the airline that made flying cheap go completely broke? That's what this video is about, because Spirit Airlines collapse is not just an airline story. It's a masterclass in what happens when a business model is built entirely on one assumption and that assumption breaks. Now, Spirit didn't fail because he had a bad idea. It failed because he had a fragile one. There's a difference. And understanding that difference is the most important lesson in this entire story. To understand why Spirit Airline collapsed, you need to understand exactly how it made money. Spirit Airlines was an ultra low-cost carrier. The idea was simple: strip everything out of the fare, no bags included, no seat selection, no snacks, no rebooking flexibility. You pay the lowest possible base price for a seat and nothing else. And then charge separately for everything the base fare removed: a carry-on bag, $50 to $80, checked luggage, $30 to $60, seat selection, $5 to $50, printing a boarding pass at the airport, and so on. Now, these extra fees are called ancillary fees, and they were Spirit's real business. The base fare was not the product. The base fare was the advertisement. It got people in the door. The ancillary fees was where Spirit made its money. In 2022, Spirit generated over $50 per passenger in ancillary revenue. On a plane with 180 seats, that's $9,000 in ancillary fees per flight on top of the base ticket revenue. The model worked, and for a while, Spirit grew really fast. It forced every other airline to lower fees on routes it entered, and it genuinely made flying more accessible. But the model had 2 structural weaknesses, and both of them came for it at the same time. Now, let's talk about the cost problem. Ultra low-cost carriers only work if their operating costs are structurally lower than everyone's else. Spirit Airlines understood this. They ordered new fuel-efficient Airbus A320 aircraft. This aircraft actually offers a 15% to 20% improvement in fuel efficiency compared to older models. They also ran a single aircraft type to simplify maintenance. They kept turnaround times short to maximize aircraft utilization, but there are costs you simply cannot engineer away. Jet fuel is the biggest one. Aviation fuel typically represents 25% to 35% of an airline's operating costs. Now, for an ultra low-cost carrier with thin margins, fuel price movements are existential. Spirit's restructuring plan in early 2026 was built around one critical assumption: jet fuel at $2.24 per gallon. Then Iran happened. The conflict in the Middle East disrupted oil supplies through the Strait of Hormuz, and fuel prices roughly doubled. The Iran war was adding $10 to $15 million in additional expenses for Spirit every single week. Spirit's own lawyers told the bankruptcy court, at $4.60 per gallon, the restructuring plan describes a company that does not exist. JP Morgan estimated that the fuel price shock was going to add about $360 million to Spirit's annual expenses. And that's more than Spirit's entire cash balance at the end of 2025. A plan that looked conservative and achievable in March 2026 became obsolete by April. But fuel was only part of the problem, because there was also a deeper issue: labor. Now, Spirit had kept costs low partly through aggressive labor negotiations, and when those negotiations went against them, when pilots and cabin crew successfully pushed for better pay, the labor cost advantage that underpinned the whole model eroded. The ultra low-cost carrier model only works at scale with low costs, and Spirit was losing scale. its costs were rising, and those two things together are fatal. A business model that is built on being the cheapest only survives as long as the cost structure that makes you cheap remains intact. The moment your costs converge with your competition, the only thing you had left, which is the price, disappears. Now let's talk about Spirit's brand problem. Spirit had a brand problem, a serious one. Ask anyone who has flown Spirit about the experience and you would hear the same things. Cramped seats, unreliable punctuality, fees that felt punishing, a customer experience that was designed around extraction rather than satisfaction. Now here is the thing, budget airlines can survive with bad customer experience if the price is low enough. Ryanair in Europe is famously uncomfortable and famously profitable. The formula works, but it only works when the price gap is large enough to justify the trade-off. That gap was closing. Delta, United, American Airlines all responded to the Spirit Airline threat by launching their own basic economic fares, stripped down, non-refundable, no seat selection, bags extra. Suddenly, a passenger comparing fares saw Spirit Airline at $89 and Delta Basic Economy at $109. The price gap was $20. Now, for $20 more, you get a seat that reclines, a carrier with a functioning app, and a reasonable chance that your flight would leave on time. Spirit's value proposition was eroding from both sides. The costs were rising from below, the majors were closing the price gap from above, and Spirit had nothing else. No brand affinity, no reason to choose Spirit other than price. When price stops being a decisive advantage, an ultra-low-cost carrier has absolutely nothing left to sell. But Spirit Airlines had a way out, and it almost took it. In 2022, JetBlue offered to acquire Spirit Airlines for $3.8 billion. It was a significant premium to Spirit's market value, and it would have given Spirit shareholders a real exit. It would have also given JetBlue the scale it needed to compete with the Big Four. But the Department of Justice blocked it. The Department of Justice argument was quite straightforward. Spirit's ultra-low fares provided a competitive check on the entire market. Every route that Spirit entered saw fares fall. If JetBlue acquired Spirit and eliminated that competitive pressure, the consumers would pay more. A federal judge agreed, and the merger was blocked in January 2024. Now, the irony is painful. The Department of Justice blocked the merger to protect consumers from higher fares, and Spirit subsequently collapsed. Now, fares on Spirit routes will rise anyway, and consumers have lost the airline entirely. This is one of the great unintended consequence stories in recent antitrust history. Was the Department of Justice wrong? That's genuinely debatable. The merger would have eliminated a competitive force, but so did Spirit's collapse. And a collapsed airline generates zero consumer benefits. What is not debatable is the consequence. Spirit had a viable exit in 2022, regulators closed it, and Spirit never found another one. The protection achieved nothing, and this is what happens when regulatory intervention does not account for the possibility that the company being protected might not survive. Now, let's talk about bankruptcy. Spirit Airlines filed for bankruptcy for the first time in November 2024, and bankruptcy is not the end. It's a restructuring process, and the company keeps operating. It negotiates with creditors. It tries to emerge as a leaner and more viable business. Spirit Airlines had a plan: shrink the network, focus on the strongest routes, and reduce costs where possible. The numbers on paper were not unreasonable. Spirit projected an operating margin of negative 5.6% for Q1 2026, down from negative 27.1% the year before. A small profit of $55 million was also projected for 2027. It was modest but credible if the assumptions held, and they did not. So, Spirit filed for bankruptcy again in August 2025, 2 bankruptcy filings in less than a year. By March 2026, Spirit had a new restructuring plan. It was a pathway to emerge from bankruptcy by summer. And then, fuel prices doubled and added $10 to $15 million in additional costs every week. In mid-April, Spirit reached out to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Spirit CEO Dave Davies also contacted White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles directly, conveying what was at stake and that thousands of jobs would be lost. Wiles helped put Spirit Airlines on Lutnick's radar, and a $500 million government bailout took shape. In return, the US government was proposing to take 90% stake in Spirit Airlines. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy scoped the industry for a potential buyer. JetBlue was called multiple times. The same JetBlue that tried to acquire Spirit Airlines for $3.8 billion in 2022. American Airlines also signaled that it wasn't interested. Eventually, no buyer emerged. Meanwhile, bondholders, which included Citadel, Cyrus Capital, pushed back on the bailout terms. The government's proposal would have relegated them to an inferior financial position. On Thursday evening, they sent a letter to Spirit's board calling orderly liquidation the only responsible path forward. They determined that they would recover more from selling Spirit's aircraft fleet than from agreeing to the government's terms. On Thursday evening, Lockney got on a 15-minute phone call with Davis and they agreed that Spirit had run out of alternatives. Spirit wanted to shut down on a quiet day. They didn't have enough cash to make it to Tuesday, and early Saturday morning, Spirit notified its staff and packed their yellow planes. Now, let me give you my honest verdict on what killed Spirit Airlines. It was not one thing, it was 4 things happening all at once. First of all, 1, it had a business model with no resilience. The ultra-low-cost model carrier works in a stable cost environment with a sufficient price gap over the competition. Spirit Airlines' cost environment stopped being stable. Fuel doubled, labor costs rose, and the price gap over the majors kept narrowing as other airlines launched basic economy. Spirit Airline had no premium revenue to absorb shocks, no high-margin revenue-generating program, and when the cost environment moved against them, there was nowhere to hide. 2, it had too much debt at the wrong time. Spirit Airline had borrowed heavily to fund fleet expansion during the pandemic recovery. When revenue collapsed and costs grew, that debt became unsustainable. $1.2 billion in annual losses requires an enormous amount of capital to sustain, and Spirit had run out. 3, there's the blocked merger at the worst possible time. The JetBlue deal would have given Spirit's shareholders an exit and Spirit operations a larger network to integrate into. But without it, Spirit Airlines had to survive alone in a market that was getting harder every year. 4, a shock that it could not absorb. The Iran conflict and the resulting fuel price spike is not Spirit's fault. Every airline absorbed the same shock, but Delta and United Airlines absorbed it from a position of strength. Diverse revenue, premium cabins, corporate travel, loyalty programs generating billions in high-margin revenue. Spirit Airlines absorbed it from a position of maximum fragility. It was thin margins, heavy debt, a restructuring plan that assumed $2.24 fuel in a world of $4.60 fuel. The same shock hit every carrier differently depending on how resilient the underlying business was, and Spirit was not resilient. Now here is what Spirit Airlines collapse actually teaches us. A business model built on being the cheapest has no defense when the cost structure that makes it cheap starts to erode. The most dangerous business model is not a bad one. It's a good one that works under specific conditions. Because when those conditions change, and they always do eventually, you have no plan B. And Spirit Airlines had no plan B. I create explainers like this every week. If that's the sort of thing you're into, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.